Hello and welcome to the video. Welcome to the channel if you are new here. My name is Nick and on this channel we talk about everything to do with Depeche Mode. And in this video I want to talk about why did Alan Wilder leave the band. So let's start at the beginning. Depeche Mode were formed in 1980 and Alan Wilder wasn't even in the original lineup. The original lineup was Vince Clarke, Martin Gore, Andy Fletcher and Dave Gahan. After several singles which established them in the pop charts, they released their debut album Speak and Spell in 1981. But after releasing the album, Vince Clarke announced that he had had enough and he wanted to leave the band. And it's at this point that Alan Wilder comes into the picture. Responding to an advert in Melody Maker, he applied to join the band. As a classically trained musician, he was more than capable to fulfill the role that he was being offered, which was as a touring member of the group. And on that basis, Alan joined the band in early 1982. In 82, the band worked on their second album, A Broken Frame, and Wilder wasn't involved in the recording of that album. Alan's first credited appearance on a Depeche Mode record came in 1983 on the single Get the Balance Right. Alan was to stay with the band for 13 years and see their incredible rise to massive international stardom. But in 1995, on the 26th of June, he announced his departure. And the big question is, why? Why leave a band at the height of its powers? A band that you were instrumental in getting to that position? And that's the question we're going to try and answer. The first and obvious thing to do is to read Alan's statement that he released in '95. Due to increasing dissatisfaction with the internal relations and working practices of the group, it is with some sadness that I've decided to part company from Depeche Mode. My decision to leave the group was not an easy one, particularly as our last few albums were an indication of the full potential that Depeche Mode was realising. Since joining in 1982, I have continually striven to give total energy, enthusiasm and commitment to the furthering of the group's success, and in spite of a consistent imbalance in the distribution of the workload, willingly offered this. Unfortunately, within the group, this level of input never received the respect and acknowledgement that it warrants. Whilst I believe that the calibre of our musical output has improved, the quality of our association has deteriorated to the point where I no longer feel that the end justifies the means. I have no wish to cast aspersions on any individual. Suffice to say that relations have become seriously strained, increasingly frustrating and ultimately, in certain situations, intolerable. Given these circumstances, I have no option but to leave the group. So what do we take from that? I think Alan sums things up fairly well there. Since being hired initially as a touring musician, he soon established himself as an important member of the group and slowly over the time effectively became the architect of their sound. Heavily involved in production, he created the atmosphere. He created the sound that became Depeche Mode, putting countless hours in behind the scenes, always the last to leave the studio. He was the workhorse of the band, crafting endlessly, perfecting their sound. By the time you get to the later albums, Black Celebration, Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith, he was incredibly important in building that sound, which gave life to Martin's songs. Yes, Martin wrote the songs, and without Martin there would be no Depeche Mode. Let's be clear about that. But what Alan did was he interpreted those songs. He gave them life, he gave them sound, he gave them atmosphere. He gave them that Depeche Mode sound. And perhaps the greatest example of this is with Enjoy the Silence, originally a slow ballad Alan injected the beat, the atmosphere, the Depeche Mode stamp onto that song, which became a pivotal hit for them and crucial in the success that Violator ended up having. And herein lies the problem. Alan never felt that he was given the credit for what he did. If we go back to his statement, he says, "I have continually striven to give total energy, enthusiasm and commitment." He goes on to say, "The level of input never received the respect and acknowledgement that it warrants." I think perhaps a very telling quote was from the producer Flood, who said, "Alan is the craftsman, Martin is the ideas man, and Dave is the attitude." But who's missing from that statement? Andy Fletcher. And I think it's only my opinion, because Alan is too much of a gentleman to really point fingers. But when you read his statement, he's alluding to the imbalance in the workload. The question is often asked, what does Andy do in the band? And he's admitted he has very little input into the making of the music. Yet, from what I've read, Andy was getting the same royalty cut as Alan. Now, how much money and royalty shares came into Alan's decision to leave the band, I doubt we'll ever know. Another huge element in Alan's decision to leave is quite obvious when you look at the timing of it. They'd finished the Devotional tour, and it's been widely documented the strain and the stress that tour put on the whole band. But if we go back even further to the recording of the Songs of Faith album, it has been equally well documented how difficult a process that was. The band was fractured, they weren't communicating. It was a painful album to make for everybody involved. When talking about the recording of Walking in My Shoes, Alan was quoted as saying, "It was a difficult period, but out of complicated relationships and difficult times comes more creative work, and that is the case in point here." It does take me back to when we recorded it, sitting in a Madrid villa that we rented, that was claustrophobic and, difficult. We spent 10 weeks and only recorded 3 songs in that time. The recording of Songs of Faith was a completely different story to when they recorded Violator, for example. At that time, the band would work closely together and they would socialise closely together. They were a team. They were a group. By the time they reconvened in '92 to record Songs of Faith, they were living very fractured lives. Dave had developed a serious drug problem, and that was causing issues within the band. He would disappear for days on end. He would keep himself very separate from the others. And on the massive world tour that followed, these problems only got worse. Dave's drug issues were spiralling out of control. Martin was struggling with alcoholism. Andy suffered with depression and had to eventually leave the tour. The tour itself almost pulled the band apart. Alan is quoted as saying about Dave's drug problems, "It is commonly thought that I left the band due to Dave's obvious problems, but this was not the case. I did think, however, that DM continuing was down to whether or not Dave could sort himself out, and at the time, things were pretty bleak." So in conclusion, I think it was a combination, a toxic mix of Alan not feeling like he was being given credit for the work he put into the band. The band was just not a fun place to be. They couldn't work together anymore. and then with the individual band members' issues stacking up on top of that, it was just not workable anymore. And I think Alan came to the conclusion that the best thing to do was call it a day and just walk away. And then there's the question of what impact did Alan's departure have on the band? I wasn't sure the band could keep going. I don't think the remaining members were sure the band could keep going after that. The devotional tour, as I said before, had nearly ripped the band apart. They all had some big issues to deal with, Dave in particular. But they did come back, and they came back really strong with Ultra. However, there's a big divide in the Depeche Mode fan community. Some people think Depeche Mode after Alan Wilder isn't really Depeche Mode. I think there was a lot of good stuff that came after, but I would agree that their peak was before he left. So there we go. I would love to know your opinions on this. If you agree with my assessment of it, or you have your own ideas. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I will look forward to reading your comments below. If you did enjoy that, please think about subscribing. This channel is all about Depeche Mode and Depeche Mode collecting. I will link my first video up here somewhere, up here, where I discover what's left of my Depeche Mode record collection from back in the day. So please take a look at that. Take care, and I'll see you soon.